Really quick, before I start the video, this is a big deal to me. Yesterday was my 3-year anniversary on YouTube. I can't believe how far the channel has come over that time, and I just want to say thank you. Now, over those 3 years, I've seen quite a few comments saying that I should make a video about the Microsoft Zune, because it failed pretty bad. I don't know how else to put it. But here's the thing, I already made a video about the Zune back in early 2018, and never released it. Well, today is the day. Everything you see after the intro was actually created back then, completely untouched. I don't know why I held onto it for so long, but it's kind of cool that I did. We're now in year 4, and here's something unseen from year 1. I think it's cool to compare it and see how the channel has changed. It is dated as far as my involvement, the writing, the voice, the editing, but all the actual information is solid. I stand by it 100%. So, alright, here we go. The Microsoft Zune and why it failed. I'm going to talk about a piece of technology that's more than 10 years old, so in order to fully appreciate most of the things I'm saying, you need to be put back in the 2006 mindset. If you were around and aware at the time, think back to the technology. If you're too young to remember it, let me help you. It was a very specific time for portable technology. A few years earlier, you needed to carry a portable CD player to listen to music on the go. A few years later, everyone was just putting music on their smartphone. But in 2006, there really weren't any smartphones. There definitely wasn't an iPhone. Almost all the phones available weren't great for music, so everybody had an MP3 player. Their primary purpose was to hold a bunch of songs, but you could play videos and play games on most of them, but they were mainly for music. The most popular of these MP3 players, by far, was the iPod. But in 2006, Microsoft decided they wanted to introduce a competing MP3 player to the market. They named it the Zune. Let's take a look at some of the reasons a consumer may have preferred the Zune over the iPod. For one, the Zune had a larger screen, only half an inch larger, but when we're talking about screens this small, half an inch is pretty significant. Looking back at the screen size of the iPod compared to what we're used to today, it was awfully small. People weren't exactly watching YouTube and Netflix on it, but they were downloading videos and playing some games. The larger screen wasn't essential, but I'm sure it was appreciated. Something about the Zune that would have blown my mind in 2006 is you were wirelessly able to transfer songs to other Zune users. It was called squirting, strange name. But the idea is if you were over there listening to Daniel Powter sing about his bad day, very big in 2006, you could ask me to send it over, or I guess squirt it over to your Zune so you can hear it. It's a good concept. I don't even think there's an easy way for us to do this with our phones today. The Zune also had a built-in radio that the iPod didn't have. So if you were still building your collection of songs, you could just tune into the radio and hear things for free. And plus, since podcasts weren't much of a thing yet and audiobooks were difficult to add to an MP3 player, the radio was probably your best option for spoken word content. The 2006 me could absolutely see why this would be appealing. Probably wouldn't be a major factor in deciding which one to buy, but it would have been considered. Those are probably the biggest selling points of the Zune over the iPod, but those positives also came with some negatives. The bigger screen size made for a bigger device. It was larger and bulkier and just not a great thing to be carrying around with you. The part where you get to share songs with other Zune users wasn't as good as it sounded either. Microsoft had some bad deals with the recording companies. After I transferred Daniel Powter's masterpiece to you, it disappeared after 3 plays or 3 days. So yes, you got to hear it, but it wasn't exactly your song. And in many cases, the whole process was probably more trouble than it's worth. I could have just handed you one of my earbuds so we can hear it together. As far as the built-in radio, well, actually, that part was pretty cool. Not much of a downside there. But honestly, when you compare the two devices, there's no runaway winner. It really just came down to personal preference. Some people preferred the Zune. They still have a little following to this day. Maybe the bigger screen size was worth the bulkiness, or maybe you valued sharing songs with your friends. Many people have said they preferred the controls on the Zune over the wheel on the iPod. But even though they were comparable devices, the iPod killed the Zune in sales. Even even during its best period, Microsoft was selling 5 or 6 times fewer devices than Apple. From everything I've come across, that was about the best comparison I could find. It wasn't even close. I can't imagine Apple ever saw them as much of a real threat. I wouldn't have. But since the device itself was at least comparable, we have to look somewhere else to explain the difference in sales. I'm sure you're familiar with the iTunes Store. That's where you bought the music and other things for your iPod. Can anyone tell me the name of Microsoft's equivalent? I wouldn't have known this, but it was called the Zune Marketplace, and it wasn't all that good. It had far fewer songs on it than iTunes, and in the beginning, it didn't have any movies or games or TV shows or anything except music. It did get better with time, but I don't think it ever got to a point where it was even close to iTunes. And since none of the software was compatible with other devices, any Zune user was forced to use this inferior store. Another thing that's commonly criticized is Zune's marketing. Apple had a pretty cool campaign, but then the commercials for the Zune were a little stranger. They took a more artistic, less fun approach that didn't appeal to the general audience, which really seems like a mistake. This is something that's meant to appeal to almost everybody, but their campaign focused on a very specific, artistic segment. I can't say I fully understand their thought process here. After the initial Zune, they quickly expanded into smaller ones, more colorful ones, different capacities, but their next big release was in 2009, with the Zune HD. It was their response to the iPod Touch. I don't want to compare these two as closely, but the consensus seems to be that the iPod Touch was better. It was now the Zune that had the smaller screen, though not much smaller. It still had the radio, but by now it wasn't quite the same selling point. The iPod soon had a camera that the Zune didn't have. Zune users were still forced to use the inferior Zune Marketplace. I should note that the Zune was now cheaper than the iPod, but the biggest difference I would say is probably the operating system. The iPod Touch was the same as the iPhone. Apple developed a great web browsing app and music app, plus they had their app store with a bunch of other apps. It was all well thought out and carefully developed. I mean, it was the same stuff going into their precious iPhone. The Zune had its own software, separate from any phone or other device. As a result, it wasn't as well developed, and most would agree it wasn't as easy or pleasant to use. When comparing the Zune HD to the iPod Touch in sales, it's even more embarrassing than the last comparison. A few years later, Microsoft admitted defeat. They stopped producing the Zune, they ended the Zune Marketplace and replaced it with other things. Today, the Zune is gone. It'd be nice for Microsoft if I were able to say there was a point where it looked promising for them, a point where the experts were predicting them to surpass the iPod, but sadly, that point never happened. We've identified some potential reasons why the Zune failed, but we haven't gotten to the root of the problem. The actual problem with the Zune is that it was competing with Apple. If you were to ask me which companies I wouldn't want to compete with, Apple during that decade would be near the top of the list. The iPod came out in 2001 and became one of the coolest things to own on the planet. By the time Microsoft finally decided to come out with their competing product, Apple had already sold millions of iPods and were completely dominating the industry.
This is, the Microsoft, Bill Gates' answer to the iPod. He's trying to, loosen iPod's stranglehold on the iPod market.
Microsoft had the near impossible task of releasing something that was good enough to pull people away from the iPod that they already knew and loved. Releasing something that was comparable to it, if not a little worse, wasn't going to do it.
This Zune has all the features of the iPod, except it's not as good, and...
Given that Apple had a 5-year head start, I wouldn't expect Microsoft to create something better.
I have no opinion on this, and it's 5 years too late.
If the Zune had been released earlier, it may have had a chance, but releasing it in 2006? It was doomed from the beginning. On top of that, 2006 was a bad time because the whole MP3 industry was about to fall. Today, most of us have replaced our iPods with our phones. It was a gradual transition, but I could tell you the year it started. It was 2007 with the release of the iPhone. I would say 2006 was the worst possible year to release a competing MP3 player. The industry was already dominated by Apple, and it was about to be reduced by Apple. Microsoft never really even belonged there. I can remember when the Zune was a thing. I knew a couple of people who had one, which now that I see their sales numbers I realize is a miracle, but I knew them. I thought it was weird. I never understood why they wouldn't just get an iPod. My perception was that the iPod was the real thing, and anything else was just an imitator. I even thought the Zune looked cool. I liked their packaging, I liked their logo. I didn't have a bad thing to say about it, except for the fact that it just wasn't an iPod. I did get an iPod right around this time myself, and I can say I never gave the Zune a second thought. It was iPod all the way. If the Zune were 10 times better and half the price, I still probably would have gone with an iPod. And I don't think I was the only one, and to me, that's why the Zune failed. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Zune. Today, it's more of a punchline than anything else.
I stood in front of a case of iPods and I bought a Zune.
But don't make the mistake in thinking it was a horrible product. I compare it to the Utah Jazz in the late 90s. The Jazz were a good team. They made 2 finals appearances, but both times they were confronted by Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. And you'd better be more than just a good team to compete against Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. If you owned a Zune back in the day, let me know what you thought of it. My guess is you probably liked it. The question I'm more curious to hear the answer to is why you decided to go with the Zune over the iPod, because you're one of the few. And if you bought a Zune HD over the iPod Touch, that's even more interesting. The Zune HD came out 2 years after the iPod Touch, so again it was late to the party, and again fighting a completely uphill battle. So what did they do to win you over? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.